Open Home, Open Bible. Here we are in Sir Cliff Richard's home, in a place not far out of London, England. And I, Richard Bewes, am very glad to be sharing with him in this little programme and sharing with you also in the study. You've got those materials with you, and we're going to take the theme of the Christian and prayer right now. And we'll first of all ask Cliff to read for us from Nehemiah and chapter 1.
Okay, Nehemiah, when he was had some bad news, said, "I sat down and wept. For some days I mourned and fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Then I said, O Lord, God of heaven, the great and awesome God, who keeps his covenant of love with those who love him and obey his commands, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to hear the prayer that your servant is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. I confess the sins we Israelites, including myself and my father's house, have committed against you. We have acted very wickedly towards you. We have not obeyed the commands, decrees, and laws you gave your servant Moses. Remember the instructions you gave your servant Moses, saying, If you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. But if you return to me and obey my commands, then even if your exiled people are at the farthest horizon, I will gather them from there and bring them to the place I have chosen as a dwelling for my name. They are your servants and your people, whom you redeemed by your great strength and your mighty hand. O Lord, let your ear be attentive to the prayer of this your servant and to the prayer of your servants who delight in revering your name. Give your servant success today by granting him favor in the presence of this man."
Wonderful. And this was the man who was the cupbearer to the king Artaxerxes, struggling to get the walls of Jerusalem built and wanting to get permission from the king to go over to Jerusalem and start the work. And he was very nervous about it, and out comes this terrific prayer. And of course you're making this your study, I know, as part of your study rather, in your group right now. Here's an interesting bit. Grant to your servant success today by granting him favour. Do you ever pray for that, Cliff, when you're doing things? You pray, do you ask for success? What do you ask for?
I've never asked for success, but there again, I was a successful person before I became a Christian. So I don't exactly take it for granted, but it was already there, success in that in terms of my career. I've often prayed for being given the right thing to do, being given the right things to say. You know, I do a press conference, for instance, and I often think, oh, please help me to say the right thing here. Not that it's going to lead to any greater success for me, but I can understand it in relation to what he's saying, though, that in point of fact, if I find favor with them by saying the right thing, if I say the right thing in terms of what God would have me say, then that in itself is a success. And so I've prayed in that way many, many times, actually. I've stopped praying for success for myself. I feel far too guilty anyway, because I've had more than my fair share of it, really. I'd rather pray for someone else's success.
Yes. Well, here is Nehemiah asking for success in getting an audience with the king and getting permission. And it's very interesting, actually, that prayer cuts people down to size. So in the context of prayer, he doesn't say, give me success and give me a favor in the presence of the great King Artaxerxes, the emperor of the whole of Persia. He says, this man, give me success in the favor of this man.
Yes.
Cuts people down to size a little bit.
Yes, I mean, I've often thought that we've all got knighthoods and people are queens and people are presidents and all that, but in the end we're all just men and women, and we have to learn to live life as humans, really, and that God, in fact, already has us down at the right size, but we seem to find it necessary, and I don't find it, this is not a criticism, because I quite like the idea that we have a queen. I quite like the idea that there are people we can look up to, and it's part of living, it's part of being human. It seems we've always needed that, and that's probably why, well, it almost certainly was the reason why God, it seemed to me sometimes in the Old Testament, reluctantly found a king for them. You know, why do you need a king? You know, you got me, sort of thing, and yet somehow it wasn't against his brief as God. He didn't say, you can't have a king. He let us have one. So obviously in God's sight too, it's all right to have somebody that we look up to, But it's necessary to understand that regardless of whether you're a king or a president or a prime minister, you're still a human being.
There's a huge democracy about prayer. We're all on the same level once it comes to praying to the God of the whole universe through Christ. I notice actually the different moods also, many moods in this particular prayer of Nehemiah's. I mean, it's prayer that weeps there in verses 4 and 5. And I don't know whether, it's kind to ask our viewers whether they weep ever in prayer. But I guess there's an ache often about prayer. Do you find that yourself?
Oh, yes. I mean, how can you not have a weep or an ache if you're praying for friends or even relations who are maybe suffering in some way, whether it be an emotional suffering, whether a marriage is breaking down or something, if it's somebody that you love and their love is falling apart, whether it be a sick child or, I've got top of my list at the moment people that I'm praying for who are a family and one of them's not well. And, you can't help it. Of course you ache. But then I've always said to myself, if I ache, what must God feel like? Even if we use the word if God exists, by very definition, every feeling that we have is multiplied 1 billion times in his heart, being, persona. And so I think it's good that we can share a little piece of that God that's within us, and it allows us to feel ache on behalf of somebody else, to feel that you need to weep, because it also weakens us in front of him. It makes us completely reliant on him.
Yes, it does. And it seems to be really common to the people of prayer that there is this ache and this sense of dependence upon God. It's also not only a prayer that weeps, it's also a prayer that worships. So there he is, verse 5, I fasted and prayed before the God of heaven. Then I said, O Lord God of heaven, the great and awesome God who keeps his covenant of love. So there's a worship aspect too. I don't know whether when you find the best time to worship, Cliff, I mean, probably in the early morning when the show is over and you're still recovering, that's perhaps not the best time for you. Well,
no, sometimes it is, because I feel that I'm almost more awake then than I am at any other time. I remember when I first became a Christian, I used to go to a lot of conferences and meet up with people that I felt totally in awe of, because they used to get up and walk by rivers at 5 o'clock in the morning and things like that. And I thought, how am I going to be that religious? How am I going to be that good? And I discovered over the years, of course, that what you do is you find the best time for you. And behind me is my garden, and I wake up every morning and take the blinds up, and I immediately have thoughts of God every single day of my life. I feel so privileged to live here, and I have beautiful surroundings to look at, and they scream out that God exists. If ever there was a doubt, if I went to bed at night with a doubt, it would be gone in the morning, no doubt about it. And when you come back to concerts, yes, when I'm touring, I never get to bed before 2. But sometimes they're almost the most wakeful moments I have, that my mind's alert, I've done a concert, it may have been a really good one, and you think, yes, and everything's buzzing and working, and I often find that that's a really, really good time to spend time with God. Because then you're alert to him.
I remember once when I was asking you in an interview in London about what it was like at the end of the show, and how you said, well, I like to try and get the Bible out, and sometimes I even fall asleep over the Bible.
Oh, yes. If really late, I find it now impossible, and it's almost become like a habit, which is not always a good thing, although I think this is a good habit to have. I cannot possibly go to bed. I cannot turn the light out unless I've done my little bit of reading. I don't mean studying, not at that time of night. But I've thought, and even if it's gone, part 2 is okay, because if you've come off stage at 11, it's only 3 hours later, so 2's all right. It's when it gets really late and your eyes are falling apart. You've gone off to some party or something, or visiting someone that's invited you around, and it's gone really late. And particularly if people start talking about spiritual things, it can get really, really late. And I come back and I think, I'm not going to miss this out. And I've often found myself, and I've gone, and I've woken up suddenly, and the lights are still on and my Bible's open. But I believe that it's a bit like we become what we eat. I think we become what we read as well. Yes. That in many ways, certainly what the Bible has to offer us is take it in and you digest it, and it can be digested over a period of years before the benefit of it comes out. So I've never given up reading the Bible, even if I'm absolutely clapped out. Which is really part of worship, because he feeds us, and then we communicate back to him in our worship and adoration and in our response. I mean, I like this very much, this worshipping aspect here of
Nehemiah, because I don't see any one specific request until he gets to the end about give your servant success today. Otherwise, it's worship, it's weeping aspect of the ache. There's worshipping. He's taking note of God's character in verse 5, of his promises in verses 8 and 9, of his redemption in verse 10. So he's saying things about God. It's all part of the worship. But then it's also, I think, prayer that that watches. As I look at verse 6, let your ear be attentive and your eyes open to the prayer of your servant, who is praying before you day and night for your servants, the people of Israel. So there's a watchfulness, a vigilance.
And that we're never going to be that far. We can't be that far away from God. If we come back to him, if in fact our prayer life has dropped out, the bottom's dropped out of it for a couple of days or a couple of weeks, we don't have to feel, yes, I think we should feel guilty and we should want to get back. But he's saying here that as wicked as we may be, no matter how far flung we are, no matter how far we think we are from God, he just will take us back if we come back. I mean, I find that it's the prodigal son thing as well.
It's very wonderful.
It's fantastic.
We don't have to go through a terrific procedure.
No, we just have to start again.
We start again.
Yeah.
So, I mean, I agree with you. There's really no guilt trip about picking up on prayer again.
No.
Because after all, if we have started with him in the first place, we are in that relationship. And that seems to be here with Nehemiah. He obviously trusts God. And then there is this, he's got these other people on his mind, this vigilance aspect. I mean, I don't know whether you keep a prayer list. Some people do. Some people have a mental prayer list.
If my list gets long, I make a prayer list. If there's specific things I want to pray for, I use it as a bookmark in my Bible. At the moment, I haven't got a prayer list, but I've got a list of people I'm praying for, and it works. But a prayer list is a really good idea, because sometimes, certainly as a public Christian, I've received things from people saying, please pray for me in this area. It's difficult when you don't know people. You have to then pray into a void saying, oh, please help these people, or whatever, Lord, I don't know what their condition is or where they are with you. You need to know more specifics, I think, sometimes to pray really, really well. But certainly when it comes to friends or friends of friends and you know a name, I think it's worth writing it down. And it's so simple, really. And I've done that many times in the past. At the moment, as I say, no, my list is not a massive list, but it is there.
I mean, I remember hearing Billy Graham, the evangelist in America, once saying that he sometimes has a list, and then it gets too long, and then he gets fed up with the list and tears it up and prays out of his heart.
Yes.
A little bit later, he starts off on a list again, try and get some discipline in. So I don't think we ever get this thing licked, never.
No, I don't think so.
So here's prayer that weeps and worships and watches in vigilance, and I can think it's also a prayer that waits, because he's asking in that verse 11, give your servant success today, but this prayer is not answered until 4 months later, chapter 2, verse 1, when he's doing the wine bit again, he's doing the butler bit to the king, and suddenly the king gives him the opportunity and says, so what do you want? What's the trouble? And at that moment, the prayer is granted. But you had to wait.
Patience, yes.
Is that a discipline that most of us find, do you think?
I think it's tough to wait, because most people stop praying because they think their prayers haven't been answered quickly enough, I guess. Oh, my prayers are never answered. I mean, I stand before you saying that, I've never had any great manifestation. I've never prayed for someone who was dying and had them live. Quite often when I've prayed for people who are dying, I mean, famous Christian people who have died. My good friend George Hoffman, he died in a car crash. Does that stop me believing in prayer? Not at all. It just means it's beyond our understanding, but it's still there. But praying constantly is a necessity for the Christian. We have to pray all the time.
So here's Cliff Richard, a man of prayer who likes to try and reach out into the world with his prayers, and I suppose I want to do the same, and I guess you want to do the same as well, because as Toyohiko Kogawa of Japan once said, the world is opened by prayer.